Hello and welcome to the Just and Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder that Just and Center as an organization is supported by donors. So if you are interested in the work that we do, you've benefited from it, you want to support us, you can go to justandcenter.org, go to our donate page and help us out financially there. We really do appreciate any help that you can give us. Now, I have been going through this series, Makers of the Modern World. Now, I've done 3 of those. This here today is number 4 in this series. I do want to say before I jump into the topic today that if there are any figures that you think that I should look at, that you would like me to delve deep into this series, please do let me know. So if you want to just leave a comment below and say, I'd like to hear one on, Kant or Hegel or Foucault or whoever it might be. So I've already gotten a number of suggestions. I have a big list of people that I want to explore in this series. And right now, though, this is the last that I have planned of the major Marxist thinkers. So I wanted to get all of these out in a kind of relatively quick line of succession as I am just reading a number of texts on these issues so they can kind of quickly follow upon one another so that if you're following this, you can get the broader scope of things. That doesn't mean that I won't delve into some other Marxist thinkers. I may do Althusser, who I know is a significant figure that is maybe a necessary piece of this that I have to delve into. But if there are others who you'd like me to look into, just let me know. So I do plan on jumping into postmodernity after this, and then eventually getting into post-Marxist thinkers and talking about how it is that conceptions of Marxism and exploitation and power kind of blend together ultimately between postmodernity and Marxism, which are in some ways very different movements, but in some ways not that different of movements. So I want to talk about that as we move forward. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to do a bit of an exploration into postmodern thinkers. So we'll certainly look at Foucault and Derrida and probably Lyotard and Rorty, some others as well. So we'll see. Anyway, we're going to jump into the individual that we are talking about today. And if you have not watched the others in this series or listened to the others in this series, you can find everything on YouTube and on podcast form, audio, and whatever podcast app that you have. But with YouTube, you do get a little PowerPoint presentation for these, so maybe a little easier to follow in that way. But we've done Marx. We looked at Karl Marx. We then started to look at the next major Marxist figure that we were looking at, which was Georg Lukács, and then we delved into the Frankfurt School. So in terms of the Frankfurt School, there were a few different figures that we looked at, mostly Theodor Adorno, that we looked at Horkheimer and Marcuse some as well. So I will be referencing some of those. If you haven't watched those, hopefully you can still follow along with Gramsci, but it may help to go back and watch or listen to the other parts before we jump into this. All right, so Antonio Gramsci and cultural hegemony. That's the major topic or the major theme that we're going to be looking at in Gramsci's thought. So the life of Antonio Gramsci. Now, if you haven't heard of Gramsci before, perhaps you haven't, and I know many of you have, but Gramsci is one of the most significant Marxist thinkers of the 20th century. He brings Marxist thought into different directions, specifically in terms of how we understand culture and the notion of hegemony, how the ruling class rules and gains and maintains its power through cultural institutions. And Gramsci has a lot of ideas that are very similar in many ways to what we see in the Frankfurt School. And as we look at Marxism within the 20th century, we see that there's a kind of increased emphasis on cultural institutions, moving away from the kind of purely economic focus that we had in Marx and Engels. All right, so there is an image here, if you're watching the video, of Antonio Gramsci. He is born in 1891 in Sardinia. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably didn't know much about Sardinia, or don't know much about Sardinia. If you're Italian and listening to this, maybe you do. But so Sardinia is an island that's west of the Italian peninsula. It was not a particularly wealthy area. So Gramsci was of Albanian descent. However, his father was from Albania, so he is not Italian in terms of descent, but that's where he was raised. Now, what's kind of distinct about Gramsci from the other Marxist thinkers that we have looked at is that he actually did, to some extent, understand financial struggle. He did not come from an upper-class family. We've seen that the majority of Marxist thinkers actually do come from upper-class families. We've talked about this perennial problem within Marxism, which is that those who are speaking for the supposed working class, the proletariat, tend to be those who are either upper-middle class or upper-class intellectuals who don't really have any work themselves within factories or the kind of things that they're really talking about. So Gramsci is actually a little different in that way, that he didn't have this kind of a background. So his parents, his dad in particular, had issues working, and there's kind of some stories surrounding that. But there were a lot of financial struggles within his childhood. So if we think about Antonio Gramsci's childhood, he grew up seeing exploitation, right, firsthand. So he's really experienced this exploitation by the wealthier Italians toward those like his father who did not have much money. Now, Gramsci himself was rather intellectually gifted. People recognize this from a very early age. And so even though he was not from a particularly wealthy or influential family, he was able to gain a lot of opportunities that many others didn't have because of his intellectual gifts. So that was very clear early in his schooling. Eventually, he did receive a scholarship to attend at the University of Turin. So he went to Turin and studied there for a while, but actually didn't finish his degree. And there were a number of subjects that Gramsci was interested in while he was there. And we see the influence of these various schools of thought in his own writings at different times. So he studied linguistics, he took courses in sociology, and then in the humanities in various ways. So he is a humanities-focused Marxist, we could say, in some ways, as we've talked about with some of those in the Frankfurt School as well. So it's not like he went to school to study economics. That was not his primary area. Now, eventually, he did leave school. He did have himself financial issues. He wasn't able to fund the rest of his schooling, and so he left. But as we'll see, even though he left, the schooling and connections that he made there did prepare him for a life of influence in significant ways. Now, it's important to say this about Gramsci as we talk about his life, because as you look at any story of his life, any biography of Gramsci, or if you watch documentaries or lectures on Gramsci, you can actually find a bit of those on YouTube and other places. He suffered from some pretty severe health issues, and we don't know exactly what those health issues were, and we know that he certainly had spinal issues. He was a bit of a hunchback his whole life, and these health issues would plague him for his entire life and eventually kill him. And we see throughout the health issues and the suffering that he had, and he was later imprisoned, as we'll talk about, that Gramsci becomes kind of a martyr for the Marxist cause. And that, I think, contributes to the significance and impact of his figure throughout the 20th century, as he is one who he was a victim. He himself was a victim in his childhood of poverty, and then he was a victim of sickness, and then he is a victim for the Marxist cause as he is eventually imprisoned for his views and his actions. So he is a heroic figure, as we see developing later in the influence that he has upon Marxist thought throughout the 20th century. So what is his relationship now to Marxism? Well, first, he's sympathetic to the plight of his fellow Sardinians. So he has been around those who are oppressed by those on the Italian mainland. So they are the ones who often are hired as producers. They are not in control of production, but they are those who are working, probably not getting paid very much. The labor conditions are not great, and they are treated generally pretty badly, and they are looked down upon as lesser than those who are on the Italian mainland on the peninsula. While he is in Turin, Turin is currently being industrialized. So he is watching industrialization in real time while he is at school. And as he is doing that, he's seeing that there are workers being brought into the factories from the poorer areas of Italy, and poor areas like Sardinia, like where he himself grew up. So now he is in this intellectual environment where he is seeing, fellow intellectuals, largely from higher classes than he himself was from, and he is seeing firsthand the exploitation then of these elites toward those who were in the poor areas as where he was from himself. So this really shapes and forms how he starts to view politics in Italy. And while he is in school, he starts getting connected with other socialist thinkers. He joins various socialist groups and socialist circles. In 1913, he officially joins the Socialist Party of Italy. As we're going to see, the Socialist Party of Italy then eventually becomes the Communist Party. The socialist movement in Italy breaks apart into a number of different factions, which Gramsci is then also going to partially blame for or use to explain the reason why there was no socialist revolution in Italy as there was in Russia. He eventually becomes a journalist. He is pretty well published already in his college years, and this is why I say that he wasn't really at a loss for opportunity in terms of his intellectual influence because he didn't finish college, because while he was in Turin, he made the right connections in order to have an influential publishing career at this time. So he was writing for the right publications. He made the right connections so that he could have a bit of an impact through his own writings. And it is really ultimately through his writings that he has the most impact even until today. He eventually was elected as a chief editor of a publication called The Cry of the People. And The Cry of the People, you could just hear from that the language of the oppressed or the exploited. He's the voice of the exploited people, and he can do that in a kind of unique sense because he has been now on both sides of this. He has seen the exploited people, he's been part of that class, and now he is one of the intellectuals here, and he's joined more elite intellectual circles. He then begins speaking quite a bit. He's very young. Remember, he's basically a college dropout, and he is invited to speak in a number of places. So he has a significant impact at a very young age, and he is speaking to student organizations, he's speaking to workers. He's invited all over the place to speak on these issues that he is also writing on. So he has now a career with his writing and his speaking. He has a pretty significant impact. Now, I just want to say a few things about the political situation in Italy at this time, because we are talking about something kind of different than what we've been speaking of with some of these other thinkers. And largely, when we've spoken about Marxism, we're talking about thinkers in Germany. As we looked at the Frankfurt School, the majority of those thinkers were of a Jewish background, who then converted to Protestantism of some kind. And then because of the persecution of the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, they fled Germany. Italy is a very different political situation. And in some ways, but in some ways it's rather similar. But Gramsci himself was not Jewish ethnically. He was not a convert to Protestantism. His family were not converts to Protestantism. He was in Italy, which is basically a Roman Catholic country. And because it's a Roman Catholic country, it's kind of the center of Roman Catholicism, because, it is where Rome is. So, because of that, a lot of Gramsci's critiques are actually going to be somewhat aimed at the Roman Catholic Church. And he's going to see the Roman Catholic tradition as a part of that which maintains the exploitation of the abused classes. So in Italy at this time, much like in Germany, you have the rise of these two, in some ways ideologically opposed, but in some ways very similar political parties. You have the fascist wing, and then you have the socialist wing. And fascism and socialism, I would take Roger Scruton's critique, where he says that they're really very similar systems in a lot of ways, because ultimately they are systems that reject liberal democracy very vehemently, and believe in the oppression of opposing voices by the imposition of their views upon the nation from the top down. So they do it in different ways, and their ideologies are different, but the result is really not that distinct, because it leads to dictatorships and oppression in either case, just for different reasons. So you have the National Fascist Party, which is founded in 1922, which exists until 1943, and then it becomes a distinct party after that. Benito Mussolini is the leader of the National Fascist Party. And if you know anything about 20th century history, you know that he exerted pretty significant leadership for an extended period of time in Italy. Now, the Fascist Party was growing in influence at the same time that the Italian Socialist Party was growing as well. So there was an increased hostility between these two opposed groups of Italians. Now, the National Fascist Party under Mussolini was highly nationalistic. So this is going to be play a significant role in Gramsci's own relationship to politics and to the party and the leadership of Italy. You know, they see themselves as really the new Roman Empire. So just as Rome had all of this power in the past, and that's part of, you know, Italy's historic past, they see that they themselves can kind of recapture. There was an attempt to recapture the beauty or the glories of ancient Rome as a nation. So they support Italian expansion to other areas. But they are highly opposed to liberalism, highly opposed to the development of liberalism in the West and the democratic process in general, as the socialists were in different ways as well. So then you have the Italian Socialist Party, which was first founded in 1892. It existed until 1994. It then dissolved and then was reformulated in now two different incarnations. So the Socialist Party still exists today in another form in Italy. But the Italian Socialist Party strongly supported the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So we have the Communist Revolution in Russia, the creation of the Soviet state. The Italian Socialist Party makes some pretty clear statements that they are in favor of that movement and are hoping very much that a similar revolution is going to happen in Italy. There is, though, a debate among the Socialist Party. And so the farther left figures end up leaving and starting their own party called the Italian Communist Party, which split off in 1921. As I mentioned before, there is some speculation that the reason why the revolution never happened is because of these kinds of divisions. There wasn't a united will, and this is an emphasis in Gramsci's writings, where he speaks about a kind of class will or a united will between the peoples that is necessary in order for a revolution to be successful. So Antonio Gramsci is one of the three major leaders of now this Communist Party. He is the head of a publication that is translated as The New Order. And that publication becomes highly influential for the Italian Communist Party. He is aligned with the Comintern, the Third Communist International. Now, if you're not familiar with the Communist International, there's a First, Second, and Third Communist International, which are really different iterations of the Communist Party throughout Europe. And this Third Communist International is commonly called the Comintern. Now, the Third Communist International is a group of communists that see themselves really as part of a worldwide communist movement. They're all interconnected. So we're going to see that the Italian Communist Party, someone like Gramsci, is very much connected to the Bolsheviks. And this is why they are really hated by the Fascist Party. You have one party that is highly nationalistic, that is for the self-interests of Italy as a nation, and wants to expand Italian territories and Italian pride and Italian identity uniquely. And then you have this other group which is global in scale, an internationalist group which essentially wants the Soviets to have control over Italy in some ways. So you see how there is this significant political clash between these two very different groups. All right, so there's the bit of the political situation, the background of where Gramsci comes from. And let's now talk a little bit about Gramsci's thought And so scholars of Gramsci divide his thought into the early Gramsci and then the later Gramsci. So we have the later Gramsci who is imprisoned, and he writes the prison notebooks, which is published in 4 volumes. Columbia University Press puts that out. And Columbia University becomes a center of American communism in really significant ways. So that is where you have figures from the Frankfurt School. They have a profound influence there. And then there is a large number of publications of communist texts that had been translated and disseminated there. So the early Gramsci, there are some changes that occur throughout the world that start, and especially in Italy, that start to shift his way of thinking. But we're going to talk about what his early writings display. And remember, he's very young. He's college age, and he starts writing. So you know how people's ideas change. Certainly your view of the world is usually much more idealistic when you are younger, and things shift significantly, especially when you're thrown in prison. So he has a pretty obvious shift in his ideas and the way that he formulates them. Well, the early Gramsci, he's very young. He believes that a revolution is going to happen in the West, in Western Europe. And so he sees the Bolshevik Revolution. He is a supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution. He writes a number of articles in support of the Bolshevik Revolution. He himself has later connections to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So he believed that there was to be an Italian revolution, just like there was in 1917 with the Bolsheviks. And this was going to be connected to international communism. So again, they see themselves not really as distinct national movements, but these national movements are connected to what is an international movement, which is the common term international communism. And in terms of how this revolution would actually come about, there were a number of different views among young Italians, socialist Italians, as to what was going to happen, right? What was going to bring this about. And remember, Marx spoke about these socialist revolutions as an inevitability. Marx believed that just as there is a kind of inevitable growth and progress of a child becoming an adult, I use the example of, a child loses its baby teeth and gets adult teeth. That's just what a child does as it grows. That's just the inevitable material process. Marx believed in a similar kind of necessity in material processes of societies, where capitalism was one stage among many, and that capitalism eventually would be superseded by socialist revolutions, which is why we can call it a scientific socialism. It was something that was just inevitably going to happen. So at this time, many Marxist thinkers are still convinced that it is going to happen. And there are a number of different ideas of how it's going to happen, what role political revolt would have in that, or if there was just going to be this obvious, easy destruction of capitalism, which would lead then to a socialist state. So the way that Gramsci saw that this was going to go about was through these workers' councils. Now, the workers' councils were essentially a group of workers that would govern the work being done in the workplace. And we're talking largely about factory work, because we're talking, industrialization at this point. So think if you have a factory, in at least the criticism of Marx is you have some very wealthy individual who, owns the factory and is in control of everything, but that individual is not really putting any work in at all. They are just kind of skimming from the top. They're taking the excess finances through the labor that is being produced by the workers who aren't being paid well, and then the one who's controlling production just takes all the extra money and makes himself more and more wealthy. And this is the basis of exploitation and injustice in a Marxist perspective. And so the workers' councils were these groups of workers which would govern the workplaces. So the workers themselves would govern the factories. So you didn't have just these wealthy individuals who were there to exploit the workers. And so these councils were largely workers themselves, And they would have delegates. So there would be some who weren't workers themselves, but they were elected by the workers. So in other words, the workers themselves, the proletariat, the working class, would have a say over the governance of these factories or these various workplaces. Now, in an earlier time, many of the socialists in Italy were hopeful that these workers' councils would bring about a revolution. But as time went on, there was less and less hope that that was actually going to happen. And Gramsci at one point really became the only individual who thought that there still was a revolutionary possibility with these workers' councils. So Gramsci was a proponent of what's called syndicalism, which is a promotion of worker unions. We still have workers' unions today, which are a kind of direct continuation of these ideas, but also mass protests of workers. And so syndicalism says basically that the revolution is going to occur through the workers themselves. It's through their protest, through the creation of union, through these workers' councils. Now, Gramsci eventually spends 2 years in the Soviet Union. He is very supportive of what the Bolsheviks are doing, and he spends 2 years there to see what's happening and then comes back to Italy and essentially wants to bring the leftist parties in Italy under Soviet control. And so he wants the Soviets to control Italy, essentially. Now, Gramsci, and some people will point this out, a lot of commentators on Gramsci will point out that he is critical at other times of what the Soviets are doing. So he is not later in life a completely, uncritical proponent of the Bolsheviks. But at this point in his life, it seems that he really is. All right, so you could see why this would be a problem, right? If you have leftist political leaders saying that we want the Soviets to control Italy and we want to just follow whatever program is laid out by Lenin, that could be a major issue. Well, he is eventually imprisoned. And his imprisonment, as I mentioned, really does make him a kind of martyr for the cause. And so he becomes this hero of the Marxists, and he still is portrayed this way often today. So Mussolini begins taking legal action against leftist revolutionary figures. Now, he's a fascist, so just like we saw with Lukács, as we spoke about how he wanted to silence all opposition, he got rid of, in the brief period where he was in charge of education in Hungary, Lukács got rid of all professors that opposed Marxism, and he supported the banning of books that were anti-Marxist. So the fascists and the Marxists really have the same goal, and that is silencing all opposition and taking full control of the ideas that are promoted within their societies. So Mussolini begins taking some action against these revolutionary figures, and Gramsci at this time is recognized as the head of the Communist Party in Italy. And to some extent, I think you can understand why there would be criticisms of Gramsci, because I mean, how would you feel about some influential figure today in politics openly telling people that he wants to simply follow what the Russians want for our nation, and that we should not have any kind of real independent existence and autonomy at all, but we should be subject to the Russians? And this is behind the, accusations of Russian collusion and all of those kind of things. So you could kind of get why there would be skepticism of Gramsci and why there would be imprisonment coming after this. So by no means am I supporting Mussolini and the fascist party in any sense, but I'm saying that you can kind of understand why imprisonment happened. So Gramsci is now sentenced to 20 years in prison. He serves a total of 11 years. He is eventually sent to a medical clinic because of all the health issues that we mentioned before. He spends 2 years in one clinic, and then he spends 2 years in another clinic. He eventually dies in 1937. He is only 46 years old. So he's relatively young when he dies. He's only 46. While he's in prison, Gramsci was not silent. In fact, Gramsci's influence today is really due to his imprisonment. It's due to the writings that he wrote while he was in prison. And the fact that he's imprisoned as a martyr for the cause certainly helps. Okay, it certainly gives a little bit of authority to what he's doing. It gives a story, around it, but that influences him highly. It's something like what you find with a Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's sometimes been said, and I think probably rightly so, that Bonhoeffer would not really have been that significant of a theological figure in the 20th century if it weren't for his story. And as a theologian, he's okay. He's got some good insights, in some places very, very good insights, but he probably would not have that significant of an influence if it weren't for his story. And that's just kind of how stories work. So the writings that Gramsci publishes as the prison notebooks, these really become influential much later. They are published and translated in the 1950s, and in the 1960s and 1970s, we start to see the publication of a lot of articles about Gramsci, and that's internationally. So his influence initially is really more so in Italy itself, and eventually, through these publications, Gramsci becomes a significant figure for leftist movements in the 1960s in particular. And think about the various student movements, say, in the United States in the 1960s. Gramsci now has a significant voice far beyond his own life and his own initial sphere of influence. And so there are, if you just do a quick search on any kind of journal database of Antonio Gramsci, you'll find quite an explosion of articles about Gramsci in the 1960s. And still today, there's a large field of scholarship surrounding Gramsci's writings. And as we talk about his primary ideas, we'll see that Gramsci's ideas are debated significantly. So just as we see in a figure like Marx, there are a number of schools of interpretation of Marx. There are a number of schools of interpretation of Gramsci, which are influential. So as I am giving you ideas here, recognize that as well, that there are a number of interpretations of Gramsci's writings and his ideas. A book that I found helpful that I just read through is called Gramsci and Marxist Theory, edited by Chantal Mouffe. Mouffe is a very, very important post-Marxist thinker. But this is a collection of a number of authors, largely 60s and 70s articles exploring Gramsci's ideas. And here you get a pretty good exploration of different approaches to Gramsci, because the authors often disagree with each other on how to interpret various points. And as I was looking through some lectures, academic lectures on Gramsci, and reading some other articles in various publications, I also came across some other very different interpretations of Gramsci that didn't align with ones there either. So he's one of these figures that there are a million ways to interpret him. So the driving question really for Gramsci's work, his later work, and his more influential work in the prison notebooks, is the same question that we saw within the Frankfurt School as well, which is simply, why didn't the revolution happen? If this was so inevitable and it was obvious that workers were being exploited, why didn't the workers stand up and do something? What is the reason why they have just kind of sat back and nothing happened? Okay, so that question really leads to the formation of the primary ideas of Gramsci and Gramsci's unique approach to Marxism. So it is pretty much affirmed by everybody that Gramsci is not just echoing Marx, that Gramsci is the foundation of a new form of Marxism. Sometimes the label neo-marxism is used to describe Gramsci's ideas. Sometimes you could talk about people as Gramscians instead of Marxists. And some people have said he's not really a Marxist at all. I think you have a hard time making a case that he's not a Marxist at all, because it's pretty obvious, I think, that Marx is really the foundation of his thought. But he does shift and move away from Marx on some very significant points. So let's talk about the first point that we need to understand to grasp what's going on in Gramsci's thought. And that is the distinction between the structure and superstructure, or we may phrase it as the superstructure and the base of society. So there is a dialectical relationship between these two things, is the language that Gramsci is going to use, using the dialectical language of Hegel and Marx. So before we jump into the nature of superstructure and base, however, you start with this foundation. Marx was wrong about the inevitability of the revolution. Okay, so what Marx referred to as a scientific socialism. And as we already discussed, that this is just the material structures of society are naturally going to lead quick end of capitalism, and then socialist revolutions all throughout the world, and there is this kind of slow progress toward this real communist utopia, as Marx himself had expected. And what Gramsci comes to realize is that the dialectic is not that easy. There is not some quick solution to the dialectic, right? So in Marx, you have the grabbing onto the Hegelian idea, where you have a thesis and antithesis, and then you have the greater synthesis. So this was supposed to happen rather quickly in Marx's view, at least in his time, and not too far past his lifetime. He saw that these revolutions would be occurring. But the dialectic instead is a bit more complex than that. We see in Adorno, he has his own take on this, where he basically says the dialectic has to just stand. The contradictions need to just be left alone and exist as contradictions. And that's really how we come to the conclusion of all of this. That's how we come to a state of peace, is essentially to say, we'll just leave the contradictions as they are. Gramsci's going to have a different take on this, but he is going to see that it is not this just upward progress of the socialist parties, because he has in Italy seen that there are certain gains that they have had in society, and then all of a sudden they have losses. So it's a zigzag that we see. If you're looking at like a chart of what's the progress towards socialist revolution, it's not this just like upward trajectory. It goes up and down and up and down. So why is that the case? He's asking. Why is it the case that it's not this just upward inevitability toward the socialist utopia? Well, he makes a distinction between the economic structure of society. We're talking about the economics, the means of production and the relationship between people and what they produce, which really is at the heart of Marx's critique of capitalism. But he says also along with this, there is an ideological superstructure. So there is this superstructure of ideology. And this is an inevitable part of society that also has to become hegemonic, he would say, in order for a revolution to happen. So while, sure, perhaps you had the economic inequalities that were very obvious, the exploitation was very obvious within capitalism. And by the way, Gramsci talks about Italian capitalism as being still kind of early stage capitalism. So he does speak about late stage capitalism, as the Frankfurt School does. But he says, well, yeah, you've got kind of a late stage capitalism in the United States, but he says Italy is like way behind that. Things are far more corrupt in Italy than they are in other places. And I'm no expert on Italian economics in the beginning of the 20th century. So like, I don't know. It's not my place to judge that at all. I have no idea. But that's at least what Gramsci says. So this distinction between the base and the superstructure is key. Now he grabs onto this from Marx. So it's not that Marx doesn't have any distinction between these two. But for Marx, the economic base is the driving force for everything. So his focus is not really on the superstructure. He talks about them as kind of a consequence of the economy. But everything is driven by the economy. And Gramsci starts to realize that this is the problem with Marx, is that the revolutions didn't happen because we didn't realize that there's a lot more to this than just the economy. And we haven't understood the fullness of how the superstructure plays into this. Okay. So let's talk then about what is the superstructure and then what is the base. So I have here an image. I didn't put this together, by the way. This was a Google search, but it's a very helpful, I think, image to explain what the superstructure and base are. So the superstructure is essentially everything that does not have to do with production in a society. And so we could talk about art, family, culture, religion, philosophy. And then we also have law, media, politics, science, education. So these are these pillars of society. And all of this is driven by ideology, he is going to say. And ultimately he's going to say it's a hegemonic ideology that is forced kind of upon the proletariat by the bourgeoisie in all of these various areas. So then we have the base. This is the means of productions and the relations of production. So here we're talking about just basic Marxist economic stuff. Property, commodities, factories, materials, how people relate to products, how they relate to production, those kind of things. And so what Gramsci is going to do is move from this focus on just the economic questions to the questions of culture. So we're talking about superstructure. We're talking more broadly about culture. Now, I know culture here in this list, in this chart, is listed as one of the many things here. But I think culture is really all of this put together. So we're talking about the art and the media that a society produces. We can even talk a lot about cultural custom as well. And that's not listed here, but Gramsci does talk a bit about that. So what he starts to see is that if we're going to address these issues of exploitation and inequality, what we need to critique is not just the economy, but Western culture itself. So we're going to have to get into the core values of Western culture and say, how can we now revolutionize these areas? So there is here a difference between interpreters of Gramsci on this point. There are some interpreters of Gramsci that see that, in his view, superstructure drives the base, so that culture really drives economics, and that's his primary difference from Marx. It's probably not the case that Gramsci sees it that way. Gramsci certainly focuses on the superstructure because he sees that that's the area that really hasn't been developed. He speaks more so of a dialectical relationship, so I think this chart shows that they maintain and shape one another. So they're constantly interrelated. I don't know that he sees one as more primary than another necessarily, but some interpreters do take it that way. I've even seen I saw one lecture from an interpreter arguing actually that he really just cared about economics and not this cultural stuff at all, which I have a really hard time seeing in Gramsci, because it seems like that's kind of his influence. I mean, that's his most significant impact upon how people think today in more leftist circles. He distinguishes, this is another distinction that is really, really important to understand in Gramsci, because he uses it all the time in his writings, and that is between the civil society and the state. So he says civil society itself is different from the state, right? The government, the top level, those who rule by power. And he's going to see this distinction in terms of civil society and the state, similar to this distinction between the superstructure and the base in some ways, in that he's going to see it as a relationship basically between consent and force. So in civil society, we have consent. You consent to, being part of a certain, religion. You consent to certain customs and things like that. But the state puts force upon you. I mean, that's kind of the point of the state, isn't it? You're forced to not do illegal things with threats of imprisonment or fines or other kinds of punishments. And we could even say in a Marxist interpretation of exploitation, force really controls labor as well. But we're talking here specifically in Gramsci about the state. And what Gramsci is going to say is, if these socialist revolutions really happen, the state's eventually not even going to be needed at all. And his goal, he has this utopian vision that we can just get away from the need of the state. Now, this is really key as you look at the distinction between Marxism and then classic liberalism. I've seen this in some articles on Gramsci make this very clear, and I think this is important, that if you look at someone like Thomas Hobbes speaks in his Leviathan about the state of nature. And the state of man in his state of nature is evil. Like we are by nature selfish, and government needs to kind of come in and stop us from harming each other. In Gramsci's approach, and in a broader Marxist approach, the state of man is not inevitably evil, right? The state of man is in essence good, and the bourgeoisie, this ruling class, is really what brings about evil in this world. The ruling class is really what brings about exploitation. So there is this hope that if we get rid of the bourgeoisie, if we destroy these forces of inequality in the world, man will now be left with his own internal essential goodness. So that there is a possibility of existing without the state at all in some ways. So that obviously is a very different view of human nature than a Christian view of human nature. Because, and I'm critical of, Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes in various ways in terms of the development of liberalism. But they do firmly hold on to the basic Christian conception that human nature has fallen. And they come from that perspective in their formation of their idea of social contract theory. And I have criticisms of social contract theory, but that's for another time. But that's what's missing in a lot of these leftist movements that we see in Marxism, is there is an assumption in those movements that man is essentially good and that utopia is possible. So now we're going to get to what's Gramsci's most famous idea and his most lasting and significant idea, which is cultural hegemony. So the basic idea here is this, that the upper classes, the bourgeoisie as we refer to them, they don't only rule through economics. It's not just that they wield power through forcing people to produce and exploiting people and taking money, but they rule by perpetuating cultural norms. And so they really rule through culture. So the problem then with the West, in Gramsci's view, is not just economic, but it's Western culture, right? Western culture is the problem. And so through culture, and we could talk about the superstructure, so we're talking about the various forms of culture, so we could talk about art, we could talk about media, or religion, or social custom. All of those kinds of things are part of this superstructure that in Gramsci's view are used to make the interests of the upper classes seem normative. And so what's really not normal at all, it just happens to be what is in the best interest of the work of the upper classes is forced upon people as if it's normal. So you're just told over and over and over again that, okay, it's normal, and then you just accept that it's normal. And if you accept that the abuses of the working class are normal, then you're not gonna push back. That's just the way it is. That's just the way society functions. That's just how the world works. In my listening to a number of lectures on Gramsci, and I can't recall who said this, but there was what I think was a helpful illustration here. And they said, well, think about the inevitability of like natural disasters, right? When you have a natural disaster and it, say you have a hurricane, it destroys your home. You're certainly mad and upset, but you don't really get mad at the hurricane, right? You don't get mad at the weather. You don't scream at the weather. Well, why do you not yell at the weather? Well, because it's not anything that you can control. It's just kind of an inevitability. Like, it's not like the weather decided I want to come and destroy your house. So it's not a person. So it's just a force. And in a similar way, culture rules in that way, so that if you have the upper classes enforcing their ideas on culture, you just see it like the weather. It's an inevitability, and there's nothing that I can do about it. So it pacifies you. Now, this, I think, is really, really important for how the political dialogue is working today. And I think Gramsci has a very significant influence on how people think and speak today. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this whole series, is these are individuals that do affect how people think today. But think about how people talk about, heteronormativity. And they use these kind of words to express this idea that, there is no such thing as, say, heterosexuality being the norm, that this is just pushed, that heterosexuality is the norm by our media and by those who are in charge and are exploiting others. So it's the cisgendered, white, Protestant, upper middle class male, like me. so you have forced, people like me have forced our ideas, on broader society, and made it seem like it's normative for people to be heterosexual. We've made, monogamy seem like it's normative, but it's really not. And you could do this with all sorts of things. You could talk about issues of like, appearances and weight, or race and gender. It's applied in all of these different areas, of course. But those kinds of discussions, you can see how that connects to what Gramsci is saying here. This idea that what is normative is really just that which is pushed kind of top down from the ruling class or the privileged downward. So because of this pushing of these ideas as normative upon the lower classes, this pacifies the proletariat, because they just think this is how the world works. That's just how it is. We can't do anything about it. So it stifles revolutionary ideas. You see how this is part of his attempt to answer the question, why has the revolution not happened? So then he says, truth and values, like what we perceive as truth, what we perceive as values in culture, they're really just determined by elite culture. They're determined by the upper class. And according to Gramsci, these are not objective or transcendent things at all, but they're historically determined. So Gramsci is radically historicist, meaning that everything for him is determined by history. There is no concern on Gramsci's part to grab onto any kind of universal truth. There are no real universal values. There are no real universal truths that you can grab onto. These certainly aren't accessible to both the upper and lower classes. Everything is determined by history and by relations of social classes within history. So as these social classes relate to one another in history, they have totally different conceptions of truth and values. So now you're not talking about questions of objective truth, of what is true, but how does this class think versus how does this class think? And I think that the place of that idea in our current discourse is also very clear. When you talk about things like, well, logical thinking being supposedly some kind of Western value, and logical thinking is not some kind of universal truth, because you're coming to that with the perspective that there is no universal truth that can be accessed by everybody that we really have access to. Instead, there are just culturally conditioned truths. You just have one class or one group of people versus another group of people. So that it's not as if there is this one objective truth that you have, or set of moral norms that the bourgeoisie and proletariat both have access to, that they can critique one another on. So you could say critique the bourgeoisie for saying you're not being consistent with these universal truth values or these universal moral values. No, all there is what is in history. So all you have is class conflict. And so this is what we talked about in the past with Ludwig von Mises' critique of a lot of Marxist thinkers, is what he calls polylogism, that there is a different logic, there are different truths between these various classes, because truth is not something that can be objectively discussed or debated, but it's simply the values of one class versus the values of another class. So Gramsci is then going to say that this hegemony, these same ideas that are pushed on through culture, this is passed on through these things. So he says social custom, passed on through education, it's passed on through media, and media obviously is very different in his day than it is today, where now it's kind of consumed the entirety of our lives in many ways, and then religion. He refers to all of this as a historic block. Now, this term was not original with Gramsci, but historic block is essentially the culmination of all of these things together that create this kind of hegemony that is passed on. Now, I want to talk again then about another theme that shows up in Gramsci, and that is passive revolution. And he speaks here about a revolution that is not really an authentic revolution. And he says here, and he uses some specific examples. He uses the United States as an example. He talks about Fordism to talk about Henry Ford, the creation of the motor vehicle, and what he sees as exploitation that happens there in factories in the United States. But he talks about how the need for revolution will sometimes be seen by the upper classes as something that they can make gradual changes while doing it in such a way that they can retain their power or keep the cultural norms and values that they already have. So there's this group of intellectual elites, those who are the elites of the bourgeoisie, who kind of create a faux revolution and can do this slowly by implementing little changes. But this, if it's done by the intellectual elites of the bourgeoisie, it's a revolution that is from above. Now, for Gramsci, this is a wrong revolution. There are those who are going to kind of take advantage of these socialist movements and try to twist or do things in a slow way, in such a way that these individuals in power can retain their power through a kind of slow transition. But Gramsci is adamant that this cannot happen from above. The bourgeoisie is incapable of reforming itself. For Gramsci, the proletariat needs to produce its own culture. Right, so first of all, he sees that this is founded on the intellectuals. Like other Marxists, Gramsci is going to see that the intellectuals are really the priests of this new Marxist religion. The intellectuals are those who tell us what is right and what is wrong and how the world functions. But these intellectuals for Gramsci cannot come from the bourgeoisie. They have to be authentically proletarian intellectuals. And so they have to really know the concerns of the lower classes. So he sees that there are going to be these organic intellectuals who are part of the lower class, because this is kind of his story. And of course, when you're talking about those who are in control or in power who can change things, all of these guys seem to find ways that they're the ones who need to be in power. But he is one of these proletarians who really understands the concerns of the people. And he becomes, because he's so intelligent, he kind of joins the intelligentsia and makes all of these important connections. But he knows the concerns of the lower classes because he's from initially the lower class. So we need to create our own new class of intellectuals, these better Marxist intellectuals who are the proletarian intellectuals. And now they basically control society instead of the bourgeoisie intellectuals. So that means that if that's the necessity, if the necessity is creating this class of intellectuals who are going to change and rule culture, or the superstructure, the elements of the superstructure, that means that the revolutionaries have to get to work in creating their own intellectuals and by creating their own counterculture. So this is referred to sometimes as counter-hegemony. So the proletariat needs to create its own hegemonic ideas. It needs to create its own culture and its own kind of united will. He can talk about a singular will that needs to be there for the proletariat. And this, again, is why he says that these revolutions in the past had failed, because there was so much division, and there needs to be a unity of will. And that can happen through the creation of one unified culture. And so there is, in Gramsci then, a disdain for the cultures of the past. And especially when you're talking about, Mussolini in the fascists glorifying Rome, talking as if they're kind of bringing back the glories of ancient Rome, which obviously is not the case. But you see this response which says, let's throw out the past. The bourgeoisie have totally defined our past. We need to start over. We're getting rid of all of our cultural traditions. We need to make a new proletarian culture. And so here's the Gramscian strategy to take over society and to cause revolution, is essentially to create its own culture, to create its own rituals, and create its own media. This is where Gramsci's ideas are so significant today, because the left has really continued in this pattern taken from Gramsci, and not exclusively Gramsci, but largely Gramsci, to say that we can use these products of culture to critique what is the accepted, Christian ideas of the West, and we can now enforce this new culture by means of the media. And, you see this through things like the destruction of the family, intentionally on a lot of people's parts, the complete redefinition of the family, because the family is one of those units of culture that has been at the heart of exploitation and oppression. And so we get rid of that, then we're moving our way toward revolution. So we see this in media. Of course, now we're talking about television, movies. These kinds of messages are, we're inundated with them over and over again, day by day by day. Certain ideas are kind of shoved in our faces until we just accept that this is the way things are. And so his evaluation then of the bourgeoisie is not just an evaluation of the bourgeoisie. It is also a strategy for the proletariat to move forward in revolution, to have this counter hegemony. Now, I've read interpretations of Marxist or of Gramsci where people say that, he was really just using that as he wasn't really trying to push this notion that we need to, infiltrate media institutions in terms of the proletariat. He's just using it as a way to kind of diagnose what the bourgeoisie was doing. I don't know how you read Gramsci and come to that conclusion. It's just not the conclusion. Gramsci is actually extremely critical of any idea that we can just sit back and theorize about anything. I mean, everything boils down to action for him. And he speaks about like the destruction of all metaphysics, the destruction of all philosophy, the end of all philosophy. I mean, he makes these sweeping statements about what his mission is, and everything boils down to revolutionary action. There is nothing else. But I do want to talk about Gramsci on religion now, as we kind of finish up here. Those are really the major themes that we see in Gramsci's writings. But here's an element that I think is key, and I'm a theologian, and I'm thinking primarily about how this affects the West and its view of Christianity, and how, as theologically minded thinkers, we would look at this. So I'm certainly concerned with how he looks at the question of religion. Now, you could probably guess in some ways how he treats religion, but I think this is actually very key about how a lot of Marxist thinkers are viewing religion at this time, and today too. Gramsci he does write about religion in his prison notebooks. And remember that he is in Italy, which is a very Roman Catholic country. And so if we're talking about the cultural customs that have preserved the current order of things, the structure of society, certainly you're going to talk about Roman Catholic Church. And so he's going to speak much more favorably about Protestantism than he is about Roman Catholicism, because of the nature of what he's fighting against and the ties of Italian hegemonic bourgeoisie, bourgeois society in the Roman Catholic Church. Gramsci is very clear in certain places, and he speaks differently in different sections of the notebooks, which written over a number of years, so this thought may have changed at some points. But religion and Marxism are fundamentally opposed ideologies. He says this in some places very explicitly. He rejects every theological, and he uses the term theological, or philosophical system that is not just a philosophy of praxis, of action. And he's critical of earlier Marxist systems. This is why he's very critical of the Marxism of his days. Like, you guys just sit back and analyze things and use this as a tool of analysis. But Marxism is not a tool of analysis. A Marxism is a tool of action. For Gramsci, everything is politics. Okay? Everything is politics. And he's very clear about this. Everything is political. Every action you take is political. He says even by thinking through ideas, you are participating in the political process because you are part of a class and are thinking through that in light of your class interests. So everything is defined by class. Everything is defined by politics. There's nothing in life that is not class-driven and political. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's where we've gone today, right? That every single thing that we talk about is political and is defined by your class. Everything. And certainly with intersectionality, we add all sorts of other things. We're not just talking about class. But so real philosophy is action. That's it. Political action. Like other Marxist thinkers, he adamantly rejects the subject-object divide. So this idea that we find in Kant that there is this transcendental I, this subject that can evaluate the world that is apart from him. He stands the idea that we can stand above and apart from the world around us. Essentially, we're talking about the idea of a soul. Right? He's rejecting the idea that we have a soul that distinguishes us as human creatures, that we can really objectively evaluate the world around us. We're just part of everything else. There is no strong divide between me and the objects that I encounter. I'm just an object among others. Then he's very clear that truth is historically determined. So he's been labeled a relativist at different points. I think he very obviously is a relativist. Some people have tried to refute that idea, but I think it seems very clear in a number of statements in the prison notebooks that he is a relativist, that he is a strong historicist, which means that everything is determined by history and our place in history. There are no objective, universal realities that stand over and above our present historical circumstance. There is, and this is key here, there is no essential human nature. And we talked about how this shows up in Marx. And the passage that we actually looked at in Marx's response to Feuerbach is echoed by Gramsci. And Gramsci grabs onto this as that particular statement as key to Marxism. And he sees that as one of the most significant developments of Marx. This idea that there is no essence of human nature, that people are their relations or social roles. So we are determined not by some pre-existent soul or divinely created essence or something like that. No, we are determined by our social relations, our consciousness, our self. Everything is social relations. So if I am social relations and class in social role, every single thing about me is defined by social relations. And so you see how this is significant today. If we're talking about identifying one another with, I'm part of this oppressed class, or you are part of an oppressor class, or and not that there aren't oppressed peoples, okay? I'm not denying oppression, but I'm saying if that becomes the essence of everything about who you are, as what class you belong to, or whether you're oppressed, or whether your class has oppressed people in the past, or you're oppressing people with this or that thing that you do now, if that's like the primary only way you think about yourself and other people, you're essentially buying into this idea. You see where this comes from. There is no essential human nature. You are your social roles and your relationship. You are your relationship between classes. So all of this is clearly opposed to Christianity and classical theology, right? So in Christianity, we're going to say that, of course, man has an essential human nature. We are created as body and soul. The entirety of our redemption is founded upon Christ taking upon himself a human nature. If there is no real essence of human nature, then Christ cannot become incarnate, and there is no redemption. So we have no Christianity without an essence of a human nature. Christianity certainly sees that we are part of creation, but we are also distinct from other elements of creation. So the lack of any subject-object divide is inconsistent with Christianity. Christianity certainly doesn't say that all ideas are essentially political. Are the most important piece of politics we have as Christians is the kingdom that is to come. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved in politics, but politics don't define us or our lives in this world. In fact, we have a coming world that is more essential. And you see this with Marxist thinkers, as they're continually critical of any hope in a world that is to come. Because for them, that's taking your eyes off of this world and the social revolution that we need to be engaged in here and now. So Gramsci does recognize that there is this deep-seated need for religion. So he can't get away from the existence of religion. And so unlike some, he's not going to say we just abolish that, but instead he says we can fill those needs. He's recognizing this is an essential human need, but we can make Marxism meet those needs. He speaks of Marxism as a secularized religion. So you see the grasp of Marxism. We talk about this idea of the totality that we have in Marxist thinkers. Marxism needs to control all elements of society for Gramsci. It becomes a religion. It is a replacement for Christianity. It is a replacement for the Christianity of Italy's past and Europe's past. He's talking in Italy, but he wants this to happen everywhere. This is an international movement. So that now we have Marxism as a replacement for religion. It has its own rituals, so we've got to develop our own rituals. He doesn't deny the fact that we are ritual creatures. We are ritual creatures. We need that, but we can replace it in a Marxist context, in his view. We can have our own rules of how to live, how to conduct ourselves in a Marxist framework. Marxists can have their own forms of art. And there are plenty of examples of that. And Marxists do not produce good art. And I think I can make a pretty good case for that. But the point is he recognizes the human need for spirituality and says we need to take God out of the equation and instead place Marxism there. It's a replacement for religion. Ultimately, for Gramsci, socialism must have this battle, this great battle. And he does use language of culture battle, cultural war. At least in English translation, that language is used. So we talk about culture wars today. Gramsci declares the culture war. And I've said before, it's hard. It's easy to say, well, I don't want to be a part of the culture war. But people like Gramsci say, you are part of the culture war, and I'm fighting you. Like what do you do when someone declares war? You don't have to want to be in the war. You're in the battle. And I think that's where we're at today, is we're in the midst of culture war. Doesn't mean we have to spend all of our time dealing with cultural battles, but you can't ignore it because war has been declared on you. You got to do something about it. So in his view, socialism must battle with the Roman Church for the loyalty of the Italian peasants. And so ultimately, in some ways, the Roman Catholic Church becomes the ultimate evil because it is the Roman Catholic Church that has taken the loyalty of the peasants, the loyalty of the proletariat. And so it's a competing movement with socialism. and that the socialist movement has to somehow capture the hearts of the peasants, has to do it through media, and has to do it through these various means of social production. And through the superstructure, the minds of the peasants have to be changed so that now they can create this hegemonic class, have a united will and ideology, and then overthrow the bourgeoisie and make this Marxist utopia that everybody wants. Well, that is my overview of Gramsci. I know there's a lot more that could be said here. There's plenty to nuance all of the things that I mentioned. And as I said before, there are tons of interpretations of nearly all of these points in Gramsci. So I'm doing the best I can for an hour here. And hopefully you find this helpful. As I said, again, make sure that you do let me know below what thinkers you want me to deal with as I continue in this series. And make sure you subscribe on YouTube as well as on your podcast app. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.